it will be of some consolation that I'm going to talk about an EU project that we've been involved in, and it's an example of how we Brits can be good European partners after all, and of how Germans and Greeks can work together productively. So you might be thinking a talk about an EU project sounds a bit dull. Well, I hope it won't be. It's about something that concerns many of us, the future of work, and journalistic work in particular. And you may have seen the recent press coverage of an article about automation in employment, and it listed jobs by their probability of computerisation. And you'll be relieved to see that teachers and educators were in the low-risk category. And although journalists weren't included, some of their activities were, and had a high probability of being computerised. So it's that potential for automation in journalistic work that I want to talk about today. The authors of the report remind us of how automation can be aggressively resisted by workers, and they give the example of William Lee, who they say was driven out of Britain by the Guild of Hosiers for inventing a machine that knitted stockings. Now, I'll come back to William Lee a little bit later. So, with that in mind, it's with a little bit of anxiety that I start this talk, because it's about how my colleagues and I have been helping to accelerate automation in journalistic work. And we've developed a tool, social sensor, that identifies trusted news through social media. So I hope there's no one from the DJV here today. I know, thanks to Constantine's talk yesterday, that they're not a fan of algorithms. If there is anyone here, then I would say that our tool is only one example of such technology, and they should probably be more worried by things like automated insights or narrative science, who, as they say, let our software do the writing for you. And they do it rather well, apparently, according to Wolfgang, anyway, in his talk yesterday. And then another example is Geophilia, which alerts editors to breaking news by location. And you may have seen the story about the heavy snow in Spain this week that trapped British tourists who've been hoping to get some winter sun. Well, just this morning I had a look at what social media content I could find in northern Spain, and there's quite a lot of actionable content that the software alerted me to. So these kind of tools, they're of obvious interest to professional journalists, but they also raise interesting questions for those of us who study journalism. So they prompt us to reflect on the social and professional contexts that have incubated their development, how they work. Do they seek to mimic existing journalistic practice and outcomes, or do their developers measure their success in different ways? And what biases might they have, and can we even find out? And then finally, how could an increase in their use change what journalists do and the products they produce? So these are the questions I'd like to explore in the talk, and to do that I'll draw on what we've learned from the Social Sensor project, which involved a range of academic and industrial partners, including Yahoo and IBM. And as we've said, it's a project that was building, designing and testing a single tool that attempted to surface trusted news stories from social media with context. Now, I don't have any shame, which is why I'm going to plug the app, so please download it from the App Store. As I said, such tools prompt us to reflect on the context, on the social and professional context that have incubated their development, and we're all aware of how increasingly social media has become a source of news for millions of people, but much of what's shared is personal and not news in the way that many of us would understand. And that which does concern the public is often not original, but it's a recirculation of previously published material. So, this is a snapshot from my Twitter stream, and it's a mixture of interpersonal communication, previously published media content, and advertising, and it's the same with my Facebook stream. So I see very little original news on my social media channels. But wait a minute, you might be thinking, what about stories like the Hudson River plane crash, which broke on Twitter about 15 minutes earlier than it did anywhere else? Or the Boston police announcing via Twitter that they'd finished their manhunt for the marathon bombers. But these are well-known examples, and they're referenced very frequently in discussions around social media as a source for news. But we've got to ask how common are they? And could it be that original high-magnitude news breaking first on social media is actually quite rare? And the mainstream media and news agencies get to hear about most of the stories they cover directly from their traditional sources. So, in assessing the potential utility and impact of tools like social sensor, we need to ask a couple of questions. So, to what extent does social media break first? News break first on social media, and to what extent does social media carry news that's not covered elsewhere? And the second question, in addition to surfacing news, what else can tools like social sensor do? And Miles Osborne, who's now moved from academia to Bloomberg, he's done some very interesting work on this that helps answer that first question. So he and his colleagues looked at samples of stories to see where they broke first. And they found that although Twitter was faster than other social media platforms, it lags behind the mainstream media most of the time. So in this sample of 29 stories, the only story to break first on Facebook was a story about Miss World. No stories broke on Google+, which is probably no surprise to you. Twitter did a bit better. It came third equal to the mainstream news wires, in some cases, but only first in 3 stories, and mostly only by a matter of minutes. And where Twitter did break news first, it was most often in sports stories, natural disasters, also in some political stories. And Osborne and his colleagues also looked at the stories that Twitter carried that the mainstream media didn't. And they came to the conclusion that certainly did carry stories that the mainstream media didn't, but many of these were sports related, like this one, or were restricted to a relatively local audience, or were of interest for relatively short periods of time. So these findings help explain why, if we look at the absolute numbers of newspaper and broadcast stories that use social media as a source, it's actually been quite small. So this study, for example, showed that fewer than 4 articles per newspaper per day quoted Twitter. And this study, the numbers were even smaller. This was for US newspapers and TV stations. Okay, this is 2011. You're probably thinking, things must have changed, in the past 3 years. Well, if we have a look at data from 2013, which is about the most recent data we can find, we can see the numbers are about the same. So 3.5 stories per newspaper per day quoting social media. So although we mustn't overestimate the potential of social media as a source of original news, there is clearly some potential, and perhaps that potential has been underexploited. So this is part of the context for the development of tools such as social censor. But there are other, probably more important reasons why the tools have been developed. So not just surfacing original news, but also in providing editors with information on popularity and sentiment, alerting newsrooms to ongoing developments in running stories, and then giving journalists information on reliability and the veracity of content, the reliability of contributors. But why are new tools needed? You may be thinking, aren't journalists getting this sort of information already? Well, to an extent, yes, they are, but it's not in sufficient quantity or quality. To evidence this, let's look at what social media journalists have been using, where they've been using it, and from whom. So we can see that tweets are mostly used to illustrate stories. And they trigger coverage much less frequently. And they're mostly used as a source in self-news, so in particular human interest, sports, and media and showbiz. And it comes as no surprise then if we look at whose social media contributions are being quoted. It's celebrities, athletes, and politicians. They come high on the list, and these are not sources that have historically been underrepresented, shall we say, in the media. So I think it's fair to say that if we look at the practice, if we observe the practice, the way that journalists use social media, it's something of a missed opportunity. Surely better use could be made of experts and those involved in the stories themselves. And we've already said social media also has the potential to surface some original stories and updates and to give heads up on trends and sentiment. One of the problems has been the volume of material out there and the number of sources that it emanates from. So, it's no surprise when we speak to journalists, even the social media savvy ones, that they felt overwhelmed by social media. So they tell us, how can we exploit the vast amount of content? We've only got a small team. We need tools, we need algorithms to take some of the pressure off. And such tools as there are currently, aren't powerful enough. So how are these challenges being addressed? These challenges of automating the identification and verification of news from social media. Well, many of the tools that have been available have been limited in their ability to automatically discover emerging news topics. And this isn't a surprise because, as I'm sure you've seen, there are a lot of non-events posted on social media. Here's some examples from Twitter. And when we try and use traditional computational techniques to find events through Twitter, they don't work very well. So, first story detection is a well-established computational technique. If you run that on Twitter, then you get a lot of false positives. So in fact, perhaps only 1% of the events that, the traditional techniques will discover from Twitter are actually what we consider to be news related. So these are some of the false positives that you would get running some of the traditional techniques on Twitter. This is what will come back as news. So techniques that we used in the social sensor project was to monitor a limited number of what we call news hounds. So these are people who are interested in, expert on particular subjects, and they find information, they share that information with others. So they could be journalists, they could be bloggers, could be activists, and so forth. And we thought if we find and follow these news hounds, and we monitor what they say, we hoped we could gather, news in a relatively rapid way, in a flexible way, and in a trustworthy way. So, how did we build our database of news hounds? Well, we started with a seed list. We seeded the database with 500 journalists on Twitter. Here's some of them. And then we expanded by including the people that they followed. So, for example, we had the BBC's chief international correspondent, Liz Doucette. She was one of the seeds on the list. So we looked who she followed. She follows over 2,000 people. So then we added all of those people to the list. But as you can imagine, if we started with 500 seeds and then we followed all the people that they followed, the numbers get quite big quite quickly. So, into hundreds of thousands. And that number becomes difficult to manage in a sort of timely way if you're trying to detect news in real time. So we needed to cut the numbers down, and so we decided to do that with a scoring system. So, we looked at whether people were verified on Twitter. We looked at whether they were on Twitter lists. We looked at how many tweets they sent, and that sort of thing. So we had a scoring system, and we managed to narrow the list down to 5,000. And we also had a blacklist of people that scored very highly, but actually weren't particularly relevant in news terms. So apologies to any Justin Bieber fans in the room. Now, interestingly, we found that if we changed the initial seed list, that didn't result in a very significant change to the final database. And we also found that if we followed more than 5,000 people, that didn't really improve the news detection results. So, in other words, with 5,000 people, we were able to capture a very high proportion of the news that was published by the mainstream media. So that was our definition of news for the experimental purposes. So what this demonstrates to us is that the dispersion on news of news on social media is skewed to a log normal distribution. So in other words, a relatively few well-informed and well-followed individuals play a key role in the dissemination of news. But who are the news hounds? Who were the news hounds that we ended up with in our database? And this is an important question, because if tools like social sensors become more widely used, then such news hounds will have an important role as gatekeepers. So for this presentation, I did a little preliminary analysis of social sensors news hounds database. So we can see that there was a bias towards men, and there was a heavy bias towards mainstream media channels and those who work for them. So there's clearly potential to interrogate such data more deeply. That wasn't the aim of the social sensor project. The aim of the project was actually to build a tool, but there's lots of potential in analysing how we did that. And more widely, the tools that are being built, what inputs do they rely on, and what assumptions are made in their design. And although, in the social sensor project, the selection of news hounds was determined by what we thought was a neutral scoring system, we still see biases, towards men, for example. So, this raises interesting questions about whether such tools should be tuned in to listen, as was the case here, to those being talked about most, to those who do the most talking, and to those who've got the largest audience, or whether such tools should be agents for change and be tuned to also pick up stories and experiences from those who are underrepresented in the public sphere. And then secondly, the data that we pulled in and manipulated for the purposes of the project has potential as a research resource in its own right. So our database of news hounds, for example, reveals those on Twitter who have the ear of journalists, because the database is made up of people that journalists follow. And just looking at the list, and the way the people on the list, or the position of the people on the list, reveals some interesting things. So, for example, I looked at this and I saw that Tony Blair's former media advisor, Alistair Campbell, scored higher than the Economist, and our own Wolfgang Bauer scored higher than Le Figaro, although at number 6,758, unfortunately not high enough to get included in the final database, so sorry. So, although there's not time to go into detail about how software like Social Censor automatically discovers and clusters news stories, I'd like to mention a couple of techniques that it used. So, one of the things it does is penalise topics that have an ongoing popularity. So, in other words, events that are bursty are seen as more important, and they're more likely to be detected as news. So, for example, here's the Twitter activity over the course of a few hours on the night of the last US presidential election. So you can see the bursts of activity, and in particular, as people retweeted Barack Obama's victory tweet. So it's interesting to consider whether the increasing use of tools that work in part by detecting bursty events might reinforce relatively passive reporting of short-term events at the expense of longer-term issues like climate change and the economy. And we should note here that social media is likely to become even more bursty with the launch of tools such as Thunderclap. So Thunderclap, in case you haven't seen it, deliberately concentrates particular social media messages into bursts, so that, in their own words, you can amplify your message with the power of the crowd. So this is actually the start of what Rasmus, I don't know if Rasmus is in the room, but what Rasmus was predicting in one of the sessions yesterday, what we might call algorithmic optimization. So an arms race between publishers using algorithms to find news, and on the other side, those with messages they want to be found, trying to trick the technology. And then another characteristic of social censor's news detection algorithm is the boost it gives to stories containing proper nouns, so people, places, organisations. And again, it's interesting to reflect on the possible effects of such methods. So, for example, exacerbate the trend towards human interest stories and the coverage of elite people and celebrities. We just had an interesting session on news values with Ansgard and others, and so this plays into some of the work that they're doing. Looking at it the other way around, could news detection software like Social Censor be instructed to consider alternative news values? So, for example, focusing on political and structural root causes and the testimonies of people involved. So I'd like to talk next about verification. It's all very well for software to alert journalists to clusters of pending topics and breaking news stories, but without context, these clusters can be a trap, as they're likely to contain a mixture of truth and lies. So Twitter, for instance, carries significant amounts of misinformation. As we know, some of this is done for laughs and is sort of fairly harmless, like these tweets that were tagged Hurricane Sandy. But fake content on Twitter isn't all done for laughs. So, there's plenty of posts that are malicious, and this was a photo used by the BBC to illustrate a massacre in Syria. And it was actually taken in Iraq 9 years earlier, and the BBC spotted this picture as it circulated on Twitter. Another example of a fake piece of social media content that found its way into the mainstream media was a shooting at LAX, and a hoax account reported that an ex-NSA chief had been killed, and that was picked up by Canada's Globe and Mail. So journalists using social media, they obviously need to exercise care. They know this already. There's some good guidelines and practice out there that focus on verification, often breaking the task down into 3 areas: looking at the content, looking at the contributor, and looking at the context. And so, if we take content, if we look at this tweet, for example, it was about a shooting at a shopping mall. It looks authentic, and indeed it was authentic because of the imperfect grammar. There's a focus on specific details, and there's emotion evidence as well. If we think about contributors, then this is a good example of where there was a contributor who was being quoted in the media. Then somebody did some investigation. This was an account purporting to be the Libyan Prime Minister. So I think it was someone from Sky News looked back at his history of contributions and found a tweet that said, "I will make all Libyans tree-hugging hippies," which kind of gave the game away that this was a fake account, but not before it had been quoted in the media and followed by our Foreign Secretary as well. And then if we look at context, then that can be useful and important as well. So in the Chilean earthquake of 2010, for example, one study showed that for every false tsunami warning on social media, there were more than 10 denials. So context can be another useful process. But of course, it's difficult to do this manual checking with the rising volume of information on social media. We see the number of tweets per minute, rising, significantly between 2 events in the US. So it's difficult to do this manually just because of all the volume of information. But there's also information about the veracity of contributors and content that no human could spot, and computers can, because we can train them with large volumes of historical material, and they can work very quickly when a story breaks. So we did this as part of the project. So we were trying to teach the software to identify fake images in social media, and we took 2 cases, the Boston Marathon bombings and Hurricane Sandy. And we trained the software using a corpus of fake tweets and tweets that we knew were real. And after training, it did a pretty good job, achieving a kind of 75% success rate, but this was only in very controlled conditions. So when we trained it in one event and then tested it on another, it did little better than random guesswork. So there's a a lot of work to do. With more training, with a bigger corpus of images, the success rate could probably improve. But it does show there are a lot of challenges in automatically giving credibility scores to an individual piece of content. It's a bit easier with a contributor, because with a contributor you've got a whole history to look at. You've got their network to look at. So in the final version of the software, the only credibility scores that we gave were to contributors, not individual pieces of content. Now, we looked at their history, looked at their popularity, the influence and that sort of thing. And generally, the higher the value for each of these metrics, the higher the contributor's credibility score. And in order to do this, we needed to take a different approach in our experiments than we did when we were developing the fake image detection. And this is because contributors, obviously they composed a mixture of stuff. Some of it might be fake, some of it might be real. So what we decided to do was test the software by comparing its scores against the scores of real human journalists. So in the first round of testing, we found out the scores came pretty close. So the software did a pretty good job at matching what the journalists felt was the credibility of the particular contributors. But then we noticed that in some cases there were some big differences. So for example, there were some contributors who were relatively inactive on Twitter, but who our human journalists thought were very credible. So this is an example. Gordon Carrera, BBC security correspondent, been on Twitter since 2011, but he's only tweeted 500 times, so pretty inactive. But actually, if you look at his profile, at his followers, he's very credible. So we found that the journalists were sort of ignoring some signals, but like inactivity, but they were paying attention to other signals. So we played around with the metrics. We added a few new ones. We weighted them, and then we got an improved set of scores. But we still found that the software was, a bit mean. Didn't really want to give anybody a very high score. So, giving a 5 to the longest-serving female MP in the House of Commons, deputy leader of the Labour Party. So there's more work to be done here. So to finish, I'd like to go back to the questions I posed at the beginning of this talk. So we've seen how journalists are drawing on the increasing volumes of social media content as a source for their stories, although often by way of illustration and in soft news. And to make that work easier and also potentially to help better exploit social media as a source of regional news and underrepresented voices, we're seeing the emergence of these digital noses for news. And at least one of these, the social censor, which I've talked about, relies heavily on the input of journalists to power many of its processes. And we've been measuring its success by the ground truth of journalists' perceptions and their current output. So in that sense, it's a tool that's being created in our own image. Yes, it's got biases. As I've shown, it prioritises stories that show a spike of interest in the short term and stories about people. And it listens to those who are vocal and to those who have an audience. And many of those are men in the media. But these are not its biases, they're our biases. So such tools are not likely to change the course of news content, I would argue. Those who want to do that must probably set their sights further afield at the multiplicity of media these tools seek to mimic, and also at the demography of those who make it. In the social science project, we found one of the greatest potentials was in the area of verification to help combat the significant problem with fake social media content. So I'll return to William Lee, if I may, and his automated knitting machine. When he showed it to Queen Elizabeth I, she refused him a patent, saying that to enjoy the privilege of making stockings for everybody is too important to grant to any individual. And given the centrality of verification to what we expect of our news media, we might agree that no individual entity, computational or otherwise, should have a monopoly on determining fact from fiction. Unfortunately, for now at least, it seems as though software is unlikely to be able to take into account all the nuances of content and context. So people, whether we call them journalists or not, will continue to be required to make that final judgment on truth and trust. Thank you.